Impressive story, but um, thank you. I've known Brad for over 20 years, and we have common interests, whether we're at the sailing club or Unitarian Fellowship. He's a real spirit and free thinker, and I'm really looking forward to his story. So, Brad, without any further ado, thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Well, members of the Sarnia Port Huron Unitarian Fellowship, it's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. And thank you very much for everyone who participated in the story, in the progressive story. It was wonderful. So this morning, I'm going to share an old Scottish fairy tale with you. And I just want to spend a couple moments telling you what got me here. I have always in the past loved stories and tales, but I left them for a period. And I got to the point where my mornings are very important to me, and I like to read and I like to have a cup of coffee. It was always the news. And about 8 months ago, I entered a very dark place. Now, I have a good friend here, Chuck, and we have coffee often. I would always say to Chuck, I know there's good news in the world. A lot of it's happening in this room, but I never feel it. I never feel it in what I'm reading. So that's when I started to read poetry, and I really started to try and read myths again. And you know what? I feel enlightened, and I have felt enlightened ever since. It's the way I start my day out now. So I'm going to share with you a Scottish tale. It was written, well, by a man called Daniel Allison, he's quite a young storyteller, and he's trying to rediscover some of the old myths. And it is an old one. It goes right back to spoken word days. And all he's done is, there's a setting in Scotland, a landscape that he was particularly just taken by. It's so powerful. So he set it in that landscape. Other than that, this is an old spoken word story that goes way back. And fairies, I'm not going to get into. They are very complex in Scotland, I found out in my reading. They are guardians of forests, of rivers. People feared them. They called them the fair folk. And they found a lot. They tried to find answers that they didn't have, and a lot of that's where it came from. So this story is called Fairy Lover. Some of the most beautiful places in Scotland are on the west coast. The magnificent, beautiful islands of the Inner Hebrides, Coll, Tiree, Rum, Iona, Skye, the Isle of Mists. And if you go further out to the edge of the world, you have the Outer Hebrides, the Isle of Bride, where the goddess walks the sand beaches today. And the furthest north is Lewis. Now, Lewis has its own Wild West. It's called Uig. Now, Uig is a landscape that attracts some and repels others. Rocky, marshy, treeless glens strewn with boulders and lochans, caves and blowholes, storm beaches and standing stones. It is a bleak and savage beauty. And this is where our story takes place. In a small town called Carter's-Potter, a young man lived with his parents in a black house. He fed the goats, he fed cattle, and he tried to encourage crops through that rocky soil. Now, he did not mind his work, but he preferred to be walking in the rocky glens and in the foothills of those mountains and along those beaches. And every chance he went there. One day he was walking there and a fierce storm blew up very quickly, and he was in those foothills. He knew a place under the boulders where he could seek shelter. There was a small cavern, and he headed there. And he ducked down, and he got inside. He wasn't alone. There was a woman sitting there with black, beautiful hair, green eyes that were like whirlpools drawing him in. And she was playing a harp. And it was a beautiful, quiet sound that filled that cavern. He looked at her and he said, I don't know you. She said, well, you do now. Sit down. So he sat down and he looked at her. He said, well, where do you bide? She said, where do you bide? car's hotter? And he said, yes, I do. And that is lovely music you're playing. She said, the music plays me. Now, he did not know how to take this, but he sat and he listened. And the music from that harp literally transformed him. He could see it leaving the cracks and crevices and moving out into that storm, the thunder and the rain and the music. And soon his head started to climb and he was drifting and he saw himself as an eagle in an ocean of stars, just soaring above the earth. And then she said, well, it's time to go now. He said, well, can I see you again? She said, yes, you can. Once again, he asked, where do you live? She said, let's meet at Mengurtsta. And then she pressed into his hand a stone knife as sharp as death. And she said to him, keep this to remember me by. So he walked home, his head was in the clouds. That stone knife was in his pocket. He could not sleep waiting for that day. And that day came. And that was the beginning of their courtship. Oh, they walked through those glens. They walked along those stormy beaches. They sat beside locks and inside caves, told one another stories and tales. They sang together. They made love together on those cold rocks. She was a wild that he had never saw before in his entire life. She could run with the red deer. She could dive into the raging waters of the ocean. And she could dance in the rain naked. Well, love roared through him like fire through dry thatch. But after a time, you know how love can silence questions? He started to think about it and wonder, why was it she never took him to her people? Why did he keep this a secret from his people? Well, the answer to that riddle was quite simple. He just did not want to hear it. But one day, they were up on a glen where the red deer roamed. It was a sprinkling of rain, and he said to her, will you tell me the truth about who you are? And she looked him in the eye and she said, I'm a fairy. And he had to accept the truth once she told him. He could no longer lie to himself about who he was with. And he walked home with a very heavy feeling. And he got home, you see, he loved his fairy lover. But there were other things pulling at his heartstrings. He loved the black house he was raised in. He loved the smell of the sweet peat, even the acrid smells of the livestock and the people. Oh, and he loved to run with his lover and sing into the pouring rains and the winds. But he also loved the warm hearth, the click-clack of his mother's needles, the smell of his father's pipe. You see, they had tended to this crop for years, and the soil was part of their blood. Now, he could run wild with his lover, but she could never be his wife. He could never be with his people, nor her with his. It just didn't work. He'd heard all the tales, and none of them were about relationships like this. And he wasn't daft enough to think that his relationship with a fairy would be any different. So the next time they were together, he ended the relationship and walked home. Well, he got home. The days went by like days must do. But he could not sleep at night. He sleepwalked through the day. The crows of grief tore at his carrion heart, and his weathered eye kept a look for her. But he never saw her. Until one day he was in a rowboat fishing off Reef Island, and he came back toward the beach, and he saw her standing in the sand. And when his eyes met her green eyes, it sent a cold chill through his blood. And he grabbed those oars and tried to row back out. She had a ball of yarn in her hand and she tossed it. He instinctively caught it. He couldn't let go. And she started to pull him in. And she pulled him in, and he was terrified. Those eyes, to him, they were as cold as the breath of Caleb. And she continued to pull him, and he could feel that small boat as it came across the sand, getting closer to her. Then he remembered the knife, that knife that was as sharp as death, in his pocket. He pulled it out and he cut that yarn. And she fell back and screamed as if she had been cut himself. He turned and he rowed as hard as he could. When he went back to his village, he did not leave only if he had to. But his love for her did fade, and his heart did start to heal. And then, one day, his mom's friend just happened to come by. And his mom's friend just happened to have a daughter who was about his age. And then his mom's friend and her mother just happened to go away for a talk and leave them together. Well, this happened quite often. And she could not play the harp. The young woman did not really have the thought or the memory to tell stories and tales. And she did not like to go out in the rain. But she did work hard. She was fun. She was kind. She was quick to laugh. She was quick to forgive. And their hearts grew warm slowly together. And it stayed. And then they became husband and wife. They lived in that black house. She became pregnant. He placed his hand on her belly, and he could feel them growing down through their feet, just like roots down into the soil. Then it came the day for the baby. And the midwife came, and she came with her helpers. His wife was shuddering and screaming. And he got quite upset. And the midwife said, look, if you're going to stay, you stay and you have to sit. Either that or you're going to have to leave. Having a child is very difficult. So he stayed and he sat. And the morning went by. And the afternoon went by. And the evening went by. And into the night. And she still screamed. And he looked at that midwife. And he didn't see the same look he saw in the morning. And he said, please, can you not do something for her? She said, gone. You have to leave here. So the door closed behind them. Now, on the Isle of Lewis in June, it's like a perpetual dusk if the sky is clear. So he could see very clearly as he walked. He knew he had to walk. And he started to climb. And he went up past various glens, and he climbed and he climbed, and he just kept on walking. And then he stopped to catch his breath. There she was, his fairy lover, sitting on a log, playing her harp. She said, come, sit down. So he sat down beside her. And she said, you seem to be troubled. He said, I am. And she said, why? And he started to tell her, and then he stopped and he said, well, you see, we have a goat, and she's having trouble giving birth. And we fear we might lose the goat and the kid. She kept playing the harp, and she said, I don't think you have a goat that is having trouble having a baby, because the goat is standing in a field of pearlwort. She said, I think it's your wife. He said, oh no, I don't have a, and she said, look, I may have been sweet on you once, but I'm not sweet on you now. And he said, it is my wife who's having trouble giving birth. And she said, okay, in remembrance of what we once were, let me help you. And she took a black cord out of her pocket, and she said, when you get home, tie this around your wife's waist, and the bairn, or the baby, and your wife will be fine. Well, he started to thank her, and she said, go now, go with haste. And he raced down those hills. It was like a stag running down. And he could see some of the firelight in the town as he got closer. And then he stopped. There was a voice in his head. He couldn't understand what the voice was. But he had a feeling, and he took that black rope out of his pocket and he tied it around that boulder. And he stepped back, and it tightened and split the boulder in half. He thought, oh, my wife, the child, they're gonna die. And he fell to his knees. He's there on his knees, and all of a sudden, those words that were in his head became clear. I do not think your goat is having trouble giving birth. She is standing in a field of pearlwood. He said, she is standing in a field of pearlwood. He suddenly got up and he ran and he leapt over that fence to the goat's field. He found that pearlwort that was growing and he pulled it. He ran out, he jumped the fence, he ran into that house, and he placed it under the small of her back gently. And he left. Not long after, a healthy baby boy was born. His wife was fine. That child was raised with so much love. And you know, he loved to wander way out in the glens and in the mountains. He wondered why his parents never. And when he got far away on those storm beaches, he thought he could hear a melody. He thought someone was watching him. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.